Welcome back. So what we're going to do in this lesson here is provision the Azure Active Directory domain services. When we deploy Azure AD domain services, what's going to happen is we're going to deploy the service, and then we're going to have to do some network configuration for the virtual network that hosts our Azure hosted domain controllers for our Azure Active Directory domain services that we are deploying here. We'll also create a second subnet called management, so we can use that to deploy a management server to it later on. We'll wrap things up by updating the DNS on the Azure AD domain services virtual network. And we need to do that so the DNS servers that are assigned to those virtual networks point to the essentially domain controllers for the Azure AD domain services that we've set up. Without doing that, our management server isn't going to be able to see our Active Directory domain. So to kick things off, we'll begin the deployment of our Azure Active Directory domain services by simply finding it up here in the search box. And we can see here we have Azure AD domain services. So we'll go ahead and select it. And we can see we don't have our domain services deployed yet. We're going to deploy Azure Active Directory domain services because this service provides us with managed domain services, which includes things like domain join, group policy if we want to perform any kind of group policy stuff within our directory, and even LDAP and Kerberos and NTLM authentication. Basically, it allows us to deploy an Active Directory environment in Azure without the need to deploy VMs and then have to support those VMs, which we would then install Active Directory on. Now, Azure Active Directory domain services integrates with our existing Azure AD tenant, which is the berksbikes.com tenant. So to begin the deployment of our Azure AD domain services, we'll go ahead and create the service here. And then what we need to do is provide some basic information and some networking information as well. What we're going to do here is deploy our Azure AD domain services into the Berksbikes LLC subscription. Now what we also need to do is deploy into a resource group. What we're going to do for this exercise is create a new one, and we are going to call it WVD Lab for Windows Virtual Desktop Lab. And we'll OK it. And this is the resource group we're going to deploy all of our resources into for the rest of the way. We're going to use the berksbikes.com DNS domain name. We'll deploy into East US. And then for the SKU here, we can change this down to standard. If we hover over the icon here, we can see that this SKU is going to determine different things like pricing and features and stuff. The standard works for what we're doing here. And it's obviously the cheapest of the bunch. Now, the forest type here allows us to specify whether it's a user forest or a resource forest. The user forest is used to synchronize both cloud and on-prem users and groups into the Azure AD domain services. The resource forest is only going to sync cloud users and groups in order to support legacy resources hosted in Azure from a trusted domain. What we're doing here is creating a user forest type, so we'll leave this selected here. And then what we'll do is we'll next through. And here is where we need to provision the virtual network that is going to host the domain controllers that we can't access. Now remember, when you deploy Azure AD domain services, you're deploying an Active Directory in Azure. The only difference is you don't deploy the VMs and you don't manage those VMs. You don't touch them at all. You can't even access them. Now, this virtual network and subnet that we deploy will host those domain controllers and any of that infrastructure to support the Azure AD domain services. Now, what we're going to do here in this lesson is instead of letting Azure do its thing here, I want to make some tweaks here just to fit my environment. So we're going to create a new virtual network. We'll leave the name at AADDS VNet, which is Azure Active Directory Domain Services VNet. But what we're going to do here for the address range, instead of using the 10.0.0.0 default, we're going to use 192.168.0.0/16. And then once we have the address space defined for our virtual network for Azure AD domain services, we need to create a default subnet. So what we'll do is we'll call this subnet AADDS subnet. I'm just copying this from a notepad over here on my other screen. And what we'll do is we'll give this an address range of 192.168.10/24. Now, the significance of this is that the address range that you give the subnet needs to fall within the address space that you define for the parent virtual network. These subnets that you define are actual pieces of the overall address space of the virtual network. So I couldn't create an address range here of 10.0.0.0 because it doesn't fall within this range that we defined up here. Now, in addition to the subnet that is going to host our Azure AD domain services, we're also going to create a second subnet called AADDS MGMT. This is going to be the management subnet for our management virtual machine we're going to deploy. Because remember, since we're deploying Azure AD domain services, there's a lot of things you can't do through the portal to manage that domain. You have the Active Directory users and computers, sites and services, all of that stuff that you would typically have in an on-prem Active Directory. We need to get access to that. So what we're going to do is deploy a management VM that will allow us to install those tools and manage our Azure AD domain once it's deployed. And this subnet is going to host that management VM because you want to keep your actual Azure AD domain services resources, and that's the domain controllers and all the stuff that gets deployed as part of that deployment. You want that kept on its own subnet, leaving a separate subnet for the management machine. And this address range here will be 192.168.2.0/24. Again, this address range for this subnet falls in with the address space of our virtual network, but does not overlap the other subnet that we've defined. And we'll OK this. And we can see here in the dropdown, we have two options now, both of the subnets that we provisioned. But the default here is the AADDS subnet, which is where Azure wants to install to. And that's what we're going to leave here. Now we can also see that Azure automatically creates the appropriate network security group and rules to protect this network. So we don't have to do anything with that. And then what we'll do is next this through. Now under this administration tab here, we need to configure settings that will specify which users will have admin privileges and notifications we can configure. Anything that's important to us here. We're not going to do any group membership management right now. We will add an administrator in a little bit, but we're not doing it at this moment. What we'll do here is just leave these checkboxes at their defaults, and then we can click Next. Now, the synchronization tab here allows us to specify how synchronization is handled. We can either synchronize our entire Azure Active Directory, or we can scope it down. For this demonstration here, we'll just leave the synchronization type set to all, and essentially we're going to synchronize everything from Azure AD into our Azure AD domain services. And then we go ahead and next it through. And what Azure will do is validate our settings here. And if we scroll down, we can go ahead and create our Azure AD domain service. Now, when we do that, Azure gives us a warning here and tells us that some of the information we're configuring is final and cannot be changed later on. The DNS name, the subscription we're deploying to, the resource group that's going to host our Azure AD domain services, the virtual network it's being deployed to, the subnet it's going on, and the forest type that we chose. And we're cool with all this, so we'll go ahead and OK it here. Now, this deployment of Azure AD domain services takes an inordinate amount of time. And what you can do to track your deployment is just simply watch the deployment in progress here. But even once this says it's complete and you get the little notice up here that says it's complete, if you bounce over to your Azure AD domain services, if you select the Azure AD domain service instance here, you'll see this status here showing deploying. So even though the notification bell will tell you that the deployment is complete, if you do go back out there and into your Azure AD domain service, you'll likely see it still deploying. And we want to wait until this deploying says it's actually, I think the term that they use is running at that point, not completed. So we want to make sure that this is no longer in the deploying state before we take the next step. So what I'm going to do here is end this lesson, and then we'll pick it up once this deployment has actually completed. And for me, in real time, it may be 20 minutes or so before this completes. It takes an inordinate amount of time. So we'll call it a wrap here, and I'll see you in the next lesson where we'll pick up after this deployment has actually completed.